I am a 36-year-old woman, and I never thought I'd find myself standing in the middle of a crowd that was supposed to celebrate love, laughter, and decades of marriage. Yet here I was, at my parents' 30th anniversary party, dressed in a pale blue dress that I had chosen carefully, hoping to look polished, gracious, the kind of daughter they could be proud of. My daughter, Sophie, clung to my hand. Her small fingers curled around mine, as if she somehow knew that what was about to happen would shake everything we thought we knew about our family. I had spent weeks trying to convince myself that I could get through this night without collapsing into the familiar ache that had lived in my chest for as long as I could remember. That persistent ache born from years of feeling like an outsider in my own family. I thought I had learned to mask it well, to smile when necessary, to laugh at the jokes I didn't find funny, and to nod along as my parents told the same stories I had heard since childhood. But walking into the lavishly decorated hall, sparkling with fairy lights and golden accents, the memories came rushing back in a torrent. The times my accomplishments were minimized, the times I was blamed for things I hadn't done, the constant invisible wall my father seemed to build between us. It all hit me at once. And yet, beneath the anxiety, there was still a flicker of hope that maybe tonight could be different. Maybe tonight, we could just celebrate them without pain. The music swelled as my mother floated past, her eyes twinkling behind perfectly applied makeup, her laughter light and carefree. My father shook hands, kissed cheeks, and gave speeches that were met with applause, while I clutched my daughter's hand, trying to stay grounded. I watched them, and part of me felt a pang of envy for the people who could belong so effortlessly, the people who could love without second-guessing, who could celebrate without the shadows of past betrayals. I wanted to belong in that light. I wanted Sophie to experience that. Everything changed when Sophie, usually quiet in large crowds, tugged sharply at my hand and whispered so sharply that I felt it in my chest. "Mom, you need to leave. Now." I froze. Her small face pale and serious, eyes wide with something I couldn't immediately name. I glanced down at her, then around at the crowd, feeling my pulse spike. What could she possibly mean? I had always warned her to be polite, to smile, to not draw attention. But this warning carried a gravity I couldn't ignore. My lips parted to ask her what she meant, to tell her there was no reason to panic. When I noticed the subtle shift in the room, the way my father's eyes lingered on me, the way my mother's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, something had changed. The air felt suddenly heavy, as if every whispered conversation had shifted toward me. It took me a few heartbeats to understand, to see it, to feel the weight of what Sophie had somehow sensed before I did. My parents' friends, distant cousins, even some of the servers, all of them seemed to be watching me with a mixture of surprise and something darker. The room that had moments ago felt safe now felt like a trap, a cage built on decades of unspoken truths and buried betrayals. My mind raced, combing through the past, trying to connect invisible dots that only now seemed to matter. And then I saw it, a photograph, newly displayed near the cake table, one I had never seen before. A younger woman, smiling awkwardly, standing next to my father. My breath caught. She wasn't my mother. I realized, with a cold clarity that made my knees weak, that there had been a secret, a long-hidden truth my parents had never shared. My father's charming facade, my mother's carefully curated life, it all suddenly felt like a performance I had been watching for years without knowing the script. The air thickened, and I felt my daughter's small hand tremble in mine. She knew, somehow, that the life I thought I had been living was built on a lie, that the world I had trusted was just a veneer over something darker. For a moment, I wanted to laugh at the absurdity, the cosmic irony of it all. But laughter wouldn't come. All I could feel was the old, familiar ache, now sharpened by betrayal, by shock, by the realization that my own life had been intertwined with a lie so profound that it threatened to undo everything I believed about my family. I looked at my daughter again, and her eyes were filled with tears, unspoken questions, and fear that mirrored my own. It was then I understood that the night I thought would be a celebration had become the night I would confront the truth. The night where the facade of my family's legacy would crumble around me. I stepped back from the display, my fingers tightening around Sophie's small hand as my mind scrambled to process what I had just seen. The photograph wasn't just a relic from a forgotten past, it was a revelation. A proof of a hidden chapter that had been carefully erased from my memory and my life. My father's eyes met mine across the room, and for the first time, I saw him not as the man who raised me, but as someone capable of deception that cut deeper than I had ever imagined. My mother's smile, forced and fragile, faltered completely, and I realized that she knew I had seen the photograph, that my presence had shattered the delicate illusion they had maintained for decades. Sophie tugged at me again, whispering, "Mom, please." I felt the raw, unfiltered weight of those two words, and suddenly, I knew that leaving was no longer just an option, it was a necessity. I didn't fully understand why yet, but instinct screamed at me that whatever secret had been exposed, it would erupt into something irreversible if I stayed. I moved toward the exit, each step feeling heavier than the last, a mixture of fear, anger, and sorrow twisting in my chest. Guests murmured behind me, their eyes flicking with curiosity and, something I couldn't name, judgment, surprise, complicit knowledge. The hum of conversation felt like a distant echo, as if the walls themselves were whispering the truth I had spent my whole life trying to ignore. Outside, the cold air hit me like a slap, sharp and unforgiving. I pulled Sophie closer, letting the night swallow us in silence. My mind replayed every moment of my childhood, every birthday ignored, every achievement diminished. Every subtle exclusion that had once felt like trivial slights. Now, they screamed with clarity. The lie that had been constructed around my parents' lives was more than just infidelity or a hidden past. It was a betrayal of my very sense of self. A rewriting of the family history that I had thought I belonged to. I found a bench beneath a flickering streetlight. Sophie nestled against my side, and I let myself finally breathe, even as the tremor in my hands refused to subside. "Mom," she said softly, the vulnerability in her voice breaking something inside me. Why didn't anyone tell me I wanted to answer her, to make sense of the senseless? But the words refused to come. I realized that this was bigger than me, bigger than Sophie, bigger than the life we had thought we understood. It was a revelation that demanded reckoning, confrontation, and perhaps vengeance. Though my heart recoiled at the thought. Hours later, when I returned to my apartment, I couldn't shake the image of that photograph from my mind. I pored over old albums, letters, and keepsakes, searching for evidence, for clues, for anything that could illuminate the shadows that had haunted my family for years. And that's when I found the letters tucked away in a box I hadn't opened in decades, written in my father's hand, addressed to a woman I didn't know, signed with a name that wasn't my mother's. Each letter was a confession, an acknowledgement of a life lived in secrecy, of promises broken, of love divided. My father had lived a double life, and my mother, complicit or blinded by desire, had allowed the lie to become our family's reality. Anger roared in my chest, unrelenting and primal, but it was accompanied by a profound sadness. I realized that the trauma I had carried for years, the lingering wounds from my childhood, were not simply the result of neglect or misunderstanding. They were the direct consequence of deception, of a betrayal that had been festering for decades. I thought of Sophie, of how her innocence had been threatened by the very people who should have protected her. And I felt a surge of determination, a need to reclaim not just my own dignity, but the truth of our lives. The next day, I confronted my parents, not with accusations shouted across a room, but with the quiet, simmering weight of truth. I laid out the letters, the photograph, the fragments of a life hidden from me, and I watched as their carefully constructed facades crumbled. My mother's tears were genuine, but they could not erase the years of complicity. My father's excuses rang hollow, a feeble attempt to rewrite history even as the evidence sat in front of him. In that moment, I felt the full force of both sorrow and vindication, the bittersweet duality of finally seeing the truth and realizing how profoundly it had shaped me. Sophie watched silently from the doorway, her small hand gripping mine, and I felt an unexpected surge of pride. For the first time, we were both witnesses to a truth that could no longer be hidden, and in that shared recognition, I found a strange sense of liberation. The pain was still there, raw and persistent. But so was the clarity, the unshakable understanding that we could move forward, carrying the scars as evidence of survival rather than shame. The days after that confrontation felt surreal, as though the world had shifted on its axis and I was seeing everything in a harsh, unfiltered light. I spent hours walking through the neighborhoods of my childhood, tracing the streets and houses that had been filled with laughter and tension in equal measure, trying to reconcile the memories with the truth I now carried. Every corner held fragments of my upbringing, the afternoons spent helping my mother in the garden, the late nights waiting for my father to come home from business trips, the whispered arguments behind closed doors that I had overheard but never understood. Each memory now seemed tainted, layered with the knowledge that what I had accepted as reality had been meticulously curated, and in some cases, fabricated entirely. Sophie sensed the shift in me, the quiet intensity that hovered in my expressions, and the way I lingered over the smallest details of our surroundings. She would ask questions, soft and hesitant, and I would answer as best I could, careful not to burden her with the rage and sorrow that threatened to overwhelm me. But I saw the weight of understanding in her eyes, a maturity far beyond her years, and I realized that she too was carrying a piece of this legacy, a piece of the pain that had been passed down through generations without explanation. My heart ached at the thought that she could feel the same betrayal I had felt, but I also knew that together, we could forge a new understanding, one rooted in truth rather than deception. It wasn't long before the ripples of revelation reached the broader family circle. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years reached out cautiously, offering condolences and sympathies that felt half-hearted, as though they were unsure whether to mourn for the past or celebrate the exposure of a long-hidden secret. Invitations to family gatherings dwindled, and whispers followed me wherever I went. It was a strange kind of exile, being surrounded by the people who had once defined my world, yet now seemed distant and foreign. I felt a mix of anger and relief, anger at the duplicity that had governed so many years, and relief at finally seeing the truth, unvarnished and undeniable. In the midst of this upheaval, I discovered another layer to the story, one I had not anticipated. An old family friend, hesitant and wary, revealed that my father had not only led a secret life, but had manipulated financial documents, diverted inheritances, and created a tangled web of debts and obligations to cover his tracks. It was a calculated, years-long effort to control not just the narrative of our family, but the very means by which we could claim our rightful places in it. I felt my blood run cold as I absorbed the implications the years I had spent trying to please him, the sacrifices I had made, all manipulated to serve his hidden agenda. My parents' legacy, the one everyone celebrated at that anniversary party, had been built on deception and self-interest, and I had been unwittingly complicit by my silence. But amidst the chaos and betrayal, a stubborn spark of resolve took root in me. I refused to allow their actions to define me any longer. I began documenting everything, compiling letters, photos, and financial records, building a meticulous account of the hidden truths I had uncovered. Each piece of evidence felt like reclaiming a part of myself, a fragment of dignity and clarity that had been stolen over the years. I reached out to lawyers and trusted friends, weaving together a strategy not just for restitution, but for establishing a foundation of transparency for Sophie and for me. A safeguard against the kind of manipulations that had ensnared me for decades. As the months passed, the tension between revelation and reconciliation became almost unbearable. Conversations with my parents were fraught, filled with half-truths, defensive outbursts, and moments of devastating honesty. My mother oscillated between guilt and denial, and my father, though remorseful in pockets, struggled to confront the full magnitude of his actions. I found myself grappling with emotions I hadn't anticipated: a profound sadness for the parents I had loved unconditionally, anger that burned in my chest, and a cautious hope that, perhaps, the exposure of the truth could lead to some form of accountability. Through it all, Sophie remained my anchor, her quiet strength, her uncanny ability to sense my moods, and her unwavering support reminded me why I had to endure this storm. Together, we navigated the minefield of family secrets, betrayal, and unresolved trauma, learning to set boundaries while maintaining our sense of self, and slowly, painfully, I began to understand that the past, no matter how dark, could be transformed into a source of empowerment rather than a prison. The breaking point came one evening when my father, in a rare moment of vulnerability, finally confessed the full extent of his deceit. We were sitting across from each other at the small kitchen table in my childhood home, the air thick with tension and unsaid words. He spoke haltingly, as if each sentence cost him something, revealing affairs I had only glimpsed in shadowed photographs, financial manipulations that had shifted inheritances, and a deliberate pattern of emotional neglect that had shaped not only my upbringing but my sense of worth. The weight of it pressed down on me, suffocating, and for a moment, I could feel nothing but the hollow ache of betrayal. Every memory, every whispered insult, every overlooked birthday, they all took on a new, unbearable significance. I listened, numb and trembling, while my mother remained silent across the room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. There was no excuse that could undo what had been done. No apology could erase the years of subtle manipulations, of trust broken piece by piece. And yet, amidst the anger, there was a strange clarity, a sense of purpose that began to take root. I realized that revenge, in its purest form, wasn't about inflicting pain on those who had hurt me. It was about reclaiming my own life, my own dignity, and ensuring that Sophie could grow up in a world that honored truth over deception. In the weeks that followed, I worked methodically. I gathered documents, reached out to lawyers, and confronted family members one by one. Each revelation cut deeper than the last, exposing a network of lies that had been meticulously maintained for decades. Some relatives recoiled in disbelief, others in anger, and a few in complicity. The anniversary party that had once seemed like a celebration became a symbol of everything I had endured, a stark reminder that appearances could be dangerously deceiving. And yet, I felt a strange sense of liberation, the kind that comes from finally speaking a truth that has been buried for too long, from finally asserting one's place in a world that had tried to erase it. Sophie remained my constant, her small hand always in mine as we navigated the storm. She understood more than her age should allow, sensing the gravity of the battles I faced and offering comfort in ways that left me both humbled and inspired. There were nights when she would fall asleep with her head on my shoulder, and I would whisper promises to her, promises that we would rise above the shadows of our past, that we would not allow the betrayals of others to define our future. In her quiet, steadfast presence, I found a renewed sense of purpose. The culmination of my efforts came in the form of a confrontation at the family estate, months after the initial revelations. I had invited my parents under the pretense of reconciliation, but the truth was far more deliberate. I laid out the evidence I had collected, documenting financial misdeeds, hidden affairs, and the emotional manipulation that had been a constant undercurrent in our family. I watched as the carefully constructed facades crumbled, their defenses falling away under the weight of undeniable truth. My father's face, once so commanding and untouchable, reflected shock and fear. My mother's eyes brimmed with tears, a mixture of guilt and regret. But they could not erase the reality of their actions. In that moment, I felt the full force of what it meant to reclaim my narrative. I had confronted the architects of my own trauma, exposed the long-hidden truths that had haunted my life, and asserted a new reality, one where Sophie and I could exist without the chains of deception that had bound our family for generations. There was no triumph in their defeat, no satisfaction in their shame, only the quiet, unassailable knowledge that I had reclaimed my dignity and the truth. The aftermath was complex. Some family members distanced themselves, unwilling or unable to face the truths that had been revealed. Others sought reconciliation, tentative and fragile, as we navigated the treacherous waters of rebuilding trust. Sophie, resilient and perceptive beyond her years, became both a guide and a companion, her presence a constant reminder that the next generation could live differently, free from the shadows that had defined mine. And as we moved forward, I understood that while the scars of betrayal would always remain, they were no longer a source of shame. They were evidence of survival, resilience, and the power of truth. Months passed, and life settled into a fragile, tentative rhythm. The chaos of revelations had given way to a quieter, more deliberate existence. Sophie and I had moved into a smaller home, one filled with sunlight and the faint scent of her favorite vanilla candles. It wasn't a grand estate or a lavish life of comfort, but it was ours, untainted by deceit, grounded in honesty, and brimming with the quiet promise of new beginnings. I found solace in simple routines, preparing breakfast with Sophie in the mornings, reading her bedtime stories with exaggerated voices and laughter, and allowing myself, for the first time in decades, to imagine a life unburdened by my parents' shadows. Yet even in this newfound peace, the wounds of the past lingered. Memories of betrayal surfaced at unexpected moments, a casual mention of my father's business trips, an echo of laughter from a family gathering, or even the sight of a photograph tucked into an old album. The pain had not vanished. It had evolved, softened by distance, but still sharp when touched. I realized that forgiveness, if it was even possible, would not erase what had been done. Instead, it would be a conscious choice to release the hold of anger over my life, to prioritize my own healing and the well-being of my daughter above all else. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the complex tapestry of human relationships. I thought of my parents, flawed in ways I had never fully comprehended. I understood now that people carry secrets for reasons that are rarely simple fear, desire, shame, or even love, twisted by circumstance. This realization didn't excuse their actions, but it allowed me to see the humanity in their failures, and in doing so, I began to release some of the rage that had once consumed me. I could not change the past, but I could control the narrative moving forward, and for the first time, that felt like empowerment rather than burden. Sophie thrived in this environment, her laughter filling our home and her curiosity bringing color and life to every corner. I watched her grow, resilient and perceptive, aware of the shadows yet unburdened by them. She asked questions, sometimes pointed, sometimes hesitant, and I answered with honesty, careful to respect her innocence while teaching her the importance of truth and integrity. In guiding her, I guided myself, learning to navigate a world that is often messy and unfair without allowing it to define who I am or who I choose to become. One afternoon, as we walked through a sun-dappled park, Sophie looked up at me with a seriousness that caught me off guard. "Mom," she said, "do you think they'll ever really understand how much they hurt us?" Her small voice carried the weight of truth, and I felt a lump form in my throat. I paused, kneeling to meet her gaze. "Maybe not," I admitted softly. "But understanding isn't always what matters. What matters is that we know the truth, and we live our lives in a way that honors it." She nodded, as if she had already grasped something beyond her years, and together we continued walking, our hands intertwined, moving forward with the knowledge that the past would inform us but not imprison us. The anniversary party, that catalyst of revelation, remained etched in my memory like a wound and a lesson intertwined. It had been a night of shock, of betrayal, and of unearthing truths that had long been buried. But it had also been the beginning of reclamation, a turning point where silence was replaced with acknowledgement and manipulation with honesty. I realized that the most profound revenge, if it could even be called that, was not retaliation or vindictiveness. It was the quiet, unwavering act of living fully, honestly, and with integrity despite the wounds inflicted by others. Years later, when I look back on that night, I do not dwell on the anger or the betrayal, though they are still part of the story. I focus on the lessons learned, on the resilience forged in the fire of deception, and on the unshakable bond between Sophie and me. I have learned that families can fracture, secrets can fester, and pain can linger across generations, but so can love, courage, and the capacity to reclaim what was lost. We carry forward not just the scars of the past, but the strength and wisdom born from surviving it. To everyone watching this story, if it resonates with you, I want you to remember one thing: never let someone else's deceit define your worth. Stand up for your truth, protect the ones you love, and know that healing is possible even from the deepest betrayals. If this story touched you, if you felt the weight of every heartbreak and the hope of every triumph, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that remind us of the power of resilience. And leave a comment below, share your story, your thoughts, or even just a word of encouragement. We all deserve to be heard, to be seen, and to reclaim our truths.